John Summers is the motoring historian. He was a company car thrashing technology sales rep that turned into a fairly inept sports bike rider. Hailing from California, he collects cars and bikes built with plenty of cheap and fast, and not much reliable. On his show, he gets together with various co hosts to talk about new and old cars, driving, motorbikes, motor racing, and motoring travel.
Good day, good morning, good afternoon. It is John Summers, the motoring historian. Today's episode is about a conference that I went to a week ago now, called Automobility User Interfaces 2024, or something like that. Of course, I go to this stuff because I feel like, as a historian, being a historian isn't just about looking at, the War of 1812. It's also about looking at what's happening at the moment and trying to do that thing that historians do, which is look closely at what's happening at the moment and try and use that to perhaps try and not foretell the future, but at least give some impression of what might be what it might be sensible to do in future based upon what's happened in the past. In other words, if you know winter's coming and you're not going to be able to grow any crops at that time, you best not eat it all in the summer. It's just that kind of, knowing what has happened other years helps you make good decisions in future. We seem to have forgotten that in our society at the moment, with our not valuing or paying storytellers properly or historians properly or anything like that. We only pay people who report on the contemporary. The wall's falling over. The wall's fallen down. It's fallen on people. It's terrible. Nobody's bothering to think about, well, who built the wall and what can we do to build the wall better next time? No, that's all for another day. We like the shock and horror of people crushed under the wall, don't we? So the 2024 Automobility User Interface Conference took place at Stanford. I don't usually have occasion to go to campus at this time of year because my class falls in the spring. So it was nice to have some time on campus again. It's nice to be in that kind of environment. I guess I'm involved because, as usual, with these things, somebody, and in this case, a number of my former students were at the conference, and one of them was, in fact, one of the organizers. So, my role, you're probably thinking, what the devil do you know about automobile user interfaces? The answer is I wasn't, giving some meaningful paper. Well, I know what I gave was meaningful. I wasn't giving a paper of my research, as I do at the, as one normally does at a conference. And this was very flattering. I was asked to do the closing keynote, and it wasn't just me. I was asked to do it with Barbara Karanian, I guess Dr. Barbara Karanian, although seems strange to think of Barbara as a doctor. But no, I've co-taught the class now for 13 years and always alongside Barbara. And in fairness, let's call a spade a spade. I am officially a teaching assistant, and I ride alongside Barbara, who's a visiting professor. I guess what she does gives my cast stuff a lot of academic credibility, and what I do gives her storytelling stuff automobility, or automobile credibility, if you like. It's as simple as Michael Shank said to me years ago that when we were talking about Pebble Beach was that, he felt like he was in an art gallery where there weren't any, badges, and he needed me, where there weren't any, information bits at the side, and he needed me to tell him what we were looking at. And more than that, he meant not just, this is a Pissarro. More, he needed me to position Pissarro alongside the other, artists of that type, and why this piece was interesting. So, this Maserati Ghibli is worth 200 grand. Look, because it's got the big motor and it's a convertible, whereas that one's only worth 150 because it's the hard top and it's in a less desirable color, and it was wrecked in 1974 or whatever. They probably all were, weren't they? Let's call a spade, by the way, with these people who are paying out of the ass for old supercars that supposedly have, completely blemish-free histories. They were all bloody wrecked in period, weren't they? Because they were always owned, supercars, hypercars, they were always owned by people like Floyd Mayweather or that half-wit that drove the Veyron into Galveston Bay. If you've not seen the video, it's worth it. They were always owned by those kind of Justin Bieber, flamboyant, idiotic people. Diddy. How did I get onto Diddy from talking about automobile interfaces? My God. So I was asked to do the keynote, so that's flattering, right? Barbara and I asked to do the keynote. Clearly, if we've been asked to do it together. Yeah, thanks, Arthur. Thanks. Bloody dog always barks when I'm talking. As Mark Gammy said in a pod when we were talking together, he probably's thinking to himself, you're yapping, why can't I? I guess he's right, isn't he? Yeah, he does think he's right. I've tried to wait him out with these things, but you know what? It never bloody works. So I was asked to do the keynote. Clearly asked to do the keynote with Barbara. Clearly at that point, what the organizers are looking for is for you to do something which they're familiar with, which in the case of one of the organizers, he'd been in the class. So it seemed reasonable to both Barbara and I that we do something that was along the lines of what we do in the class. But, you have 10 weeks and 10 weeks of 2 hours where you can get to know the class, and it's in a small space. So trying to replicate what we might do in a classroom setting. If you want to Google up the course, by the way, it's ME236 Tales to Design Cars By. And as I said, Barbara, my colleague, Professor Barbara Karanian. And the ancient history on that, whilst we come to mention it, is the great and the good of Pebble Beach, folk like Miles Collier, Fred Simeone, they realized that Jay Leno, they realized some years ago that the issue with shifting generations and old cars was bigger than, the values on, not so interesting 30s cars was going down then. And of course, now it's 50s and 60s cars, right? They recognized that it was bigger than that. It was bigger than once upon a time there were many people in the Los Angeles area who could rebuild a Barani wire wheel for a Ferrari, but those people were all old and were all dying, and that was, an issue for somebody like Jay Leno. That was where it was felt first, but people like Miles Collier over in Naples in Florida there at the Revs Institute, he realized that the issue was deeper than that there was a generational thing going on, that fundamentally young people didn't care about cars. This was about 10 years ago. So with people like McKeel Haggerty, they came to Stanford and were like, can you try and do like a humanities inspired thing that links science, a cross-disciplinary, a truly transdisciplinary thing that will put the car front and center of academia. Awesome idea. I got involved in the program with Michael Shanks, who's an Englishman. He grew up in an English nuclear submarine town. So did I. He's about 10 years older than me, but other than that, he went to Cambridge and was very successful academically, me rather less so. But other than that, we have quite a lot in common. We have very similar kind of approaches. I think he certainly sat down and met with me the very first time, because he was intrigued with the idea of me making money walking around the forum telling stories about Rome. It just completely plays into he's an archaeologist, Greek stuff, but Roman stuff as well, but really just a passion for stories. And it was that passion for stories that led him to introduce me to Barbara, which is why Barbara and I got involved in doing the class together when, there was a Revs program at Stanford, and when Miles and all these other wealthy guys from the car community made a big endowment to the university. You're probably wondering what happened with that, by the way. Actually, you're probably wondering why I'm not talking about the UI conference yet. But let me finish this Titus groan digression here. First of all, what happened was there were three really key professors involved in it. The guy that I worked with, Michael Shanks, who was an archaeologist, so for him it was contemporary archaeology, and he became very passionate and interested in cars as archaeological objects, which fascinated the car guys and fascinated me, and altogether awesome. And Michael, I can't thank you enough for the insight that you've brought to me over the years. On the right hand, and really on the edge of campus, an organization called Vale, the Volkswagen, oh bloody hell, I can't remember the acronym now, the Volkswagen Automotive Innovation Laboratory, on the edge of campus there. This was, the time, this is 2012, 2013. This is when autonomous research into autonomous cars, when it's clear that this is a data crunch and you just need to do a lot of miles, but really this was a decade before Waymo, more than before it was baked for market. And of course, Stanford was involved in that research through Vale. So we had an Audi TT, or they had an Audi TT, and they would use it to lap Thunder Hill and take all of this data. And it was really very exciting to be involved with, because it was clear at that time that this was going to be the future. The guy that ran that was a guy called Chris Gerdes, and he was really all hard science, right? And then plugging this together, the guy with the relationships with the car companies and the guy with a feel for humanities and a feel for the hard science was this guy, Cliff Nass. And really, he was the original, mad, eccentric, just mega brain academic. That's how you'd thought of him. And I was thinking the last time I saw him, he was driving his Volvo 740, and I was involved in some kind of film shoot with a Jaguar XK120, and he came along and interrupted the film shoot, and the producer sort of shooed him and his Volvo out of frame. And that was the last time I saw him. He had a heart attack in his mid-50s, and it was, it was, I've known a couple of people go like that, and it's shocking when it happens. It makes you realize that all of life is like a motorcycle ride, and you never know when you can go, frankly. But look, I don't want to dwell on that macabre note. But yeah, Cliff, we lost Cliff, and that meant that the money maybe towards what Chris was doing with the research with Shelley, the autonomous Audi TT out at and various other sort of hard science things, which frankly, the Revs guys probably, Miles Collier went to MIT, he probably could have had MIT do that kind of research. But anyway, so I think that's why programs at Revs sort of dried up, because, and I've tried to give you some insight there into the politics of Stanford there. But yeah, I said to Michael as it was all happening, this feels like it's like medieval baronies in France, like medieval France or England, where, if you are like aligned with the wrong people, you just don't go anywhere. Whereas if you're aligned with the right people, you ascend to new heights. And yeah, that's completely how it works. And when you make an endowment to a university, you can't say like, I want this to do this kind of project, not that kind of project. You're making the endowment, and that's just how it works. So anyway, so there was Revs at Stanford for a little bit. Our class survived because our class is an arts-based class. It's a storytelling class that sits in the mechanical engineering school. So look, and it's been successful in terms of people who have continued to come to it. And look, that's worth talking about now, although this is a digression. Why do people continue to come to the class? Well, because automobile design is so bloody exciting at the moment, isn't it? I don't mean that, as a car guy, you might not be excited about car design, but personal mobility is in a period of revolutionary change that's more exciting than it has been at any time since the 1920s, right? When, everybody could afford a car and lots of people could drive, and there were proper car mechanics and there was proper gas distribution. The design, this pivot to electrification and autonomy and the different ownership models, even though they're not coming as quickly as it looked to us 10 years ago, it looked like they were going to be here by now in the mid 2020s, but we aren't there yet. But as usual, in the short term, we underestimate the impact of technological change, and in the long term, in the short term, we overestimate it, and in the long term, we underestimate it. So in other words, we at the moment we're feeling like, oh, is autonomy ever going to come? And by 2050, we're all going to be in flying cars. Like, my neighbor who works for Joby Aviation. That's a total digression. I'll put the link in. Really interesting in what they're doing is flying cars. Because, of course, you can't really do flying cars where we drive, because then everyone has to have their own PPL, right? Since bloody people can't even drive properly, you can't expect everybody to have a PPL. Well, if the cars can fly themselves, when autonomy comes, they can fly, right? Why not? Right? Why not? I mean, I'm just hoping, right, that when everyone's in their flying helicopters, the roads are going to be empty and I'm going to be able to drive them in my cars and sports bikes. That's what I'm hoping. I'm going to listen to this back and be like, where was I going with that? I was going somewhere with that, wasn't I? So it was flattering to be asked to do this keynote speech. And I guess the irony of it is, it's probably more people are going to listen to this pod than were in that audience. But because that's like a face-to-face experience where, you've like put on nice clothes for it, and it's not, taking place in your basement when you're looking at some of your crappy jigsaws, that has a completely different vibe to it, and I guess you forget what that in-person vibe is like, and that's what's special about attending a conference. So what our class is about when a student gets to Stanford, they've already put themselves in the top sort of 1-2%, because that's how many people, that's how few people get in based upon the number of applications, right? So it's natural for them as they move towards graduation and looking for a job to think to themselves, what am I going to do to really make myself stand out? Because they've stood out up to now, so it's natural for them to look for like a Sterling Moss, like unfair advantage, or it's not an unfair advantage, but just something that's gonna. And if you're gonna come from a hard science kind of background, like, and a lot of our students, some are product design, but we have aero, astro, mechanical engineering, hard mechanical engineering, people who have majored in maths and science since perhaps they were 16 or 17, and they're now in their mid-20s when they're having this thought that I might need to think about how to present myself in a job interview, or how to conduct myself when I'm, invited to do some kind of like a hackathon-y kind of project. I need to decide how I'm going to, handle myself in that situation. So I might get a job out of it rather than, you know what I mean? If you think about, I always feel like this with car mechanics, the reason that car mechanics choose to be car mechanics is because they like cars and they like working with machines. So the whole element of dealing with people, like explaining to them why, yes, you've only just got a leak on the thermostat, but I want to buy a new thermostat, and I want to buy a new water pump, and I'm going to charge you for all this new coolant as well. People don't understand why that needs to be. It feels like they're being ripped off. That's not the case. You just, people don't understand understand the situation properly, and it's hard to explain. Yeah, so what I'm saying is that these students are looking for some kind of a way to communicate about themselves in a really clear way. So the fact that Barbara and I have this class where it's about storytelling, and the storytelling is themed around cars, that is a useful vehicle, pun intended, for people to be able to think about, both cars of the past and cars of the future, and also their own involvement with cars, and how that can relate to, if they're design people, how that might relate to product design, how that might relate to presenting their own ideas to peers, or any employers, or anybody else. So look, right, that's sort of what we've developed over the last decade. We thought that we would condense, try and condense some of what we do in the class into the hour-long keynote that we had. Now, a lot of what I do with Barbara, it feels like a double act, right? And I have said to people, if we are a double act, who's the straight man, and who's the because interplay between us on stage, neither of us really knows quite what the other one's going to say. We know each other really well, but we don't quite know. I never say the same thing twice, and Barbara's whole teaching style is, I feel like she's the opposite of Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. He always says that a lawyer, when he asks a question to a witness on the stand, he should always know what the answer's going to be before the witness says it, because he's using the witness to build his case and build an argument. Well, I naturally operate in an environment where I quite like to know. I quite like to not be sure what's around the curve. I'm comfortable with ambiguity, to use Barbara's parlance, but she seems to unconsciously thrive on putting people, herself included, on the spot. She doesn't mind, if somebody's not listening or looking at their phone or something like that in the classroom setting, she'll challenge them full on, around not concentrating. It's really refreshing, frankly, in a modern classroom setting that she demands that level of focus, and she demands it, from herself as well, in that, so we did a little, we did like a microcosm of our class. It seemed to go over extremely well, in that the organizer was flattering, and other people were complimentary about what we did, and so that's pleasing, right? Isn't it? That's something that whenever you do something that's a little bit experimental, you're never sure whether it's going to work. And when it works in one setting, you're never sure whether it's going to work in another setting. When you're working with somebody where you're not sure what they're going to do, where you're looking for audience participation, which we did right from the start, at first a show of hands, but later come up and share your stories on the microphone. Well, that's a lot. If you've not engaged with people, then nobody's going to come up, and then your whole thing is going to, it's going to fall flat, right? It's obvious that you've not engaged if nobody wants to participate. Whereas even if you've only engaged with 30% of the audience, and there's another 70% who are sitting there being like, what the fucking hell is this all about? If the 30% are enthusiastic and are sharing, which they absolutely did, sharing their own experiences similar to the things that, us up on stage did. Yeah. So pleasing is the long and short of it. I've taken 25 minutes to say that, but I don't know. Maybe this won't feel like 25 minutes when you're listening back, because I'll have edited it down. So let's actually get to the nitty gritty. Well, so let's talk about how I'm going to structure this. I've got like a little intro piece now, which has already run much longer than I intended it to. I've got, and then I made notes on some individual sessions, and that's worth talking about because it will break out the individual, ideas. So I think let me frame this whole thing first, and by saying that when I think of an automobile user interface, what I'm thinking about are the gauges, the steering wheel, the shift lever, and the pedals. But almost every element of the conference was about how autonomous vehicles are going to communicate with us or with passers-by. In other words, it was less about, whether or not you have like nice leather or not, or vegan leather, as somebody, we'll talk about this guy in a minute, this guy from Bentley that I spent some time talking with. Less about what the traditional automobile user interface, and far more about how people are going to interface with mobility devices when they're autonomous, or when their scooters on a sidewalk, or when there's lots of people on the bus versus one person riding on the autonomous bus. There were lots of so as usual with these things at Stanford, you go thinking it might be about one thing, and then find it's sort of about that thing, but it's also that thing thought about in a much more deep way. I've had that. This is why I love being involved with the university, right? Because you have that kind of deeper insight. But look, let me actually get stuck in, right? So the Bentley guy who Barbara and I sat down with just at a table when we were working together to complete what we were going to present on, and he just happened to be across the table, and Barbara struck up conversation with him because she strikes up conversation with everybody like that. In that first conversation, he said to me, look, he said, I don't like screens. I feel like screens shouldn't be the focal point of interior design. And I was like, I was like friends forever with him at that point, because it's clear that he's thinking deeply about this whole conundrum of how do you make Bentley modern without throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Because, of course, the awesome thing about a Bentley is the old-fashioned wood and leather and clock and, old-fashioned gentleman's drawing room experience of a Bentley. So it's what do you keep, what do you throw out? So that was a really interesting conversation. And if you take nothing away from this presentation other than the fact that most automobile design now begins with the screen as the focal point, and it pulls out from that. And he said to me, I don't get it. Interior design, we don't start with a television and design the living room around that. Why are we doing that with cars? But I think this is because we're in a first generation of these kind of vehicles. And at the moment, we're still like fully screen focused because we're in this place where 40% of people use some stuff, but not very much. 30% of people buy the car because of the tech and care about the tech and connectivity and rah. And 30% of people are like me and just don't give a shit. I mean, I realized I'd driven that Tundra 1,100 miles before I even tried to work out if my phone could connect to it. My phone connected to it, and that's all I've done. I've not used the navigation, not done any of the touch screen on it. My phone can connect. I can listen to my JTech EasyM. I'll add a link. Love JTech. That's what I listen to. I listen to that through the Tundra stereo. Works perfectly. That's all I need. For me, 2016 is too high tech. And I'm not alone, apparently. I represent about 30% of new car buyers, let alone overall car buyers. So I think we will pull back from this screen focus. But this Bentley guy, and he's a young'un, but this Bentley guy was the first person who I had ever engaged with who was like, I don't like screens. And I thought it was brave sitting at a conference like this one to be like that straight away. So that was really cool. One of the other headlines is around Waymos. Now, just in the last couple of months, the Waymos, self-driving Jaguar I-Paces, have moved from being something which, you had to sign up for the program and be like an approved user and probably provide them with lots of feedback about how the car drove. That phase is now done, and anybody can drive or can ride a Waymo. Amusingly, my wife managed to break it the first time she used it because she put the 3 Germans who were visiting us in the back, and she rode in the front with Ollie on her lap, and the car drove a block. And then a human voice came over the tannoy being like, Dutch, there's 3 people in the car. There's too many people in the car. One of you has to, get the fuck out. I dare say it didn't say that, but that was, basically what it was driving at, quite literally. And just a word on these Waymos. One of the famous tropes 10 years ago was an autonomous car that sat at the intersection of University and Cooper, just outside the university in downtown Palo Alto. And it sat at one intersection for 2 hours because it was waiting for its turn to go. But of course, in the real world, nobody waits for their fair turn. Everyone just walks or, drives when they can. And the car was completely confused by that because it was so rule following. Well, one of the astonishing things about these Waymos, and I've only had a couple of rides in them, is that they actually drive like, they actually, as Dana said, they actually drive, they actually go, which means that, at the stop sign, sure, it complies with the law and it stops, but it doesn't stop and lean back and then go. It pauses the brake and then it goes. And just like, just like I do, I don't quite roll it, but nor do I, so there's that assertiveness that they have, which has to be tuned for each urban environment, right? That assertiveness that they have is really interesting anyway. So the fact that the whole business of being able to ride a Waymo and what was a Waymo like and all of that was like the weather in terms of a topic of conversation for conference delegates. And it should be said that this is about 200 people who've come from all over the world. So the last one of these conferences, like last year, it was in Brisbane. It was in Stanford like 3 or 4 years ago, but there was another one like somewhere like Dubai or something like that. Like it's really a Ingolstadt, not Dubai, Ingolstadt, because and this is another feature of the community that there's a lot of Asian women, it would seem, involved in these research projects. So Japanese, Koreans, Chinese Americans, but there's also an awful lot of Germans. and the Germans all speak bloody perfect English, to the extent that I said to one of them, dude, when the conference was in Ingolstadt, did you speak German? And he goes, no, it was all in English. And I'm like, really? And he's like, well, all the research papers are in English. So, so it's weird. It's literally like, if you're in that space, you speak German with your friends. But, when you're all of the work that you do, it's like reading magic. All of the work that you do is in English, all of it. And you're doing research papers in English. It's really, so that was, and that, of course, that's really a great way to position the conference is, at Dana's place, they have this, thing, the imposter syndrome, where, because everyone's so clever and accomplished, you feel like you're not accomplished enough. And the negative element of this is Michael Shanks, my colleague, the high school that his kids went to, they have, an issue with suicides. And it's, as when I said to him, but Michael, why? He was like, well, it's because no one's, they've not made $1 million by the time they're 17, kind of thing, because there's this massive peer group pressure to succeed. I guess what I'm saying is, everyone at Stanford's clever. Everyone you meet is clever. And that is fun to be around. It pushes you under pressure, but it is also really stimulating to be around. It's why I have carried on doing the class, frankly. And certainly when you come to a conference like this, and I want to be around the conference to mingle with the people and understand it before. And, the people that had invited us to speak, they were keen that we come to sort of the banquet, dinner evening and all of that, because that's is a better opportunity to mingle than necessarily in the sessions there. So I mentioned that I had some former students involved. I'd say there's about half a dozen people, some of whom I recognise, most of whom I spoke to. What are they doing now? 2 are academics in the field. 3 are with car companies, so Ford, BMW, Zoox. Yeah, I'm looking at my next note here, and as usual, I've done things out of order. My next note was German speaking perfect English, intimidating intellect, and yeah, that's completely what it was. So, all right, what did I learn? I'm going to go through the talks that I did sort of one by one, but there were a number of different events, and just from a storytelling perspective, it's worth, thinking about what worked well, if you like, and what didn't work so well. So there are 3 days. In the day's papers, and then one of the evenings, a sort of mingling session where people had prepared posters. And the posters outlined the idea that they had. So it wasn't a full paper. It maybe wasn't fully researched, but it was the idea laid out on the paper, and then on the poster there. So you could look at the poster, and then the dude that did the research or had the idea or whatever, he's there. So you can ask any clarifying questions and engage with them. A super simple idea, but what an absolutely awesome way to communicate. It was one of those things where I was like, I can't believe I'd never been to an event where this kind of poster workshop selling the idea thing before. I just thought that was absolutely brilliant, because you could engage with the things that you wanted to. You can engage to the extent that you wanted to. It was really a fun thing. So that was one of the evenings. Another one of the sessions I sat in, and this was really compelling as well. It was short videos. And so they'd stacked like 8 of these 5-minute videos, or 8 videos. It was 8 videos. I don't know how long they were. Anyway, they'd stack them back to back. But in order to make sure that you were properly engaged and really thinking about them, they asked you to rank your top 3 of the 8. And then at the banquet, they announced a winner. I'll talk about the individual ideas in a minute. I just thought that was a great way, the two, right? The duality of the short format video, which you watch in a cinematic kind of setting because they put it up on the big screen and you're sitting there voting. And you know that in 3/4 of an hour, this is going to be done. So you're not going to be there like, there's not 20 videos to watch, there's 8. So yes, it demands a level of concentration, but we're all in the conference, and the conference was pretty expensive. So we were talking about participation earlier, and they were right to expect that level of participation. And the bulk of the conference is the traditional conference way of papers where people present their academic research, and that is fundamentally pretty dry. I mean, that was the language that I heard used a couple of times, and of course what people mean by that is fucking boring. And I thought a lot about this as a storyteller, because it shouldn't be boring, because the ideas are interesting. But so often the way in which the presenters, and it's not the presenters' fault, the presenters have to present in a certain way. They have to say, this is the research that we were doing. This is how we set about doing it. This is what happened. And this is what we learned, and this is what we think should happen, going forward. So with that format, and I guess that's why I like the video format, because you were like, it was like these people would have like 20 minutes or however long on stage, right? And within, whereas the videos, they were like 3-4 minutes long. And all right, you could say, well, the ideas in the video were less well developed, but I just feel like the short format was very compelling. But for all that, after people finished speaking, there were lots of people coming up to the microphones that were set up and having questions that they wanted to ask. And quite often, not everybody got all their questions asked. And one of the things that they did also was they had a sort of, leather couches up on the stage. And often they'd sort of do 3 or 4 that was similar together. And then afterwards, they'd have somebody who knew the space very well be a sort of chairperson, and that person would run a panel discussion then, and people would ask questions of the panel rather than of individuals. So I feel like the dryness is a feature, not a bug, right? That there has to be this level of if this is a conference which is on the very cutting edge of this kind of research. This is where automobile designers come to get ideas. This is where PhD students kick around the idea of, is this a real project? Am I solving a real need? Is the methodology that I'm doing, is that meaningful? Is somebody else working on the same thing? Can I network with them and try and do this? There's really an awful lot going on here, and this really quite, and I felt like most other people, I wouldn't say everybody knew everybody else, but most people had been to the conference before. A surprising number of people had been to the Brisbane one and the Ingolstadt one, which shows how unusual what it is that you're doing, and this is. And this is why, there was a really interesting blend of ideas which were fully baked, ideas which weren't baked, or people working on similar ideas, which made you feel like, oh, this is the zeitgeist of what's happening at the moment. So 2 of those zeitgeist areas that I thought that I felt like I encountered was, one is, how do you tell people that the autonomous car needs you to take over and drive? It's having an emergency. It needs you to take over and drive. Now, apparently, the industry standard is 3 to 5 seconds. So it has 3 to 5 seconds to say, motherfucker, you need to drive. Or, shake the seat. Or maybe have a dog barking, or, warm you up gently. It needs to find some way to make you take over, because if it does what I just did, Quite often people sit up, engage, and then crash the car. This is what one German PhD student told me. I was like, I mean, you can, when she said it, it seemed so obvious, she was like, but the people, when they take over, then they make bad decisions. They do not look in the mirror. They swerve, they crash. And I'm like, yeah. And I could see that she's distraught, right? Because, the machine, it was doing a better job. It had already decided that you couldn't swerve. That was why it needed you to take over. You could see I realized how in that moment how passionate she was about solving this thing. Anyway, she had a system of lights, which graduated system of lights, and a number of people were working on light-based things. So the BMW one was absolutely fascinating. This was like dynamic lighting where you can not just change the interior lighting of the car, but also change the way the light reflects on things like the leather on the inside. So the color of that seems to be different. You can also do things like push buttons. So, answer the phone call, listen to the voicemail message, set the navigation going, that you can do that from a light button, which you can, yes, put onto a surface on the car, but you can also do it onto the back of your hand. I'm actually going to sit down with the guy because it was one of my students, the guy that organized the conference. That was his project, one of the projects that he'd worked on. And that was one of the most fascinating things that I encountered, because that seemed ready for market. That seemed ready to go to market. A lot of the other stuff I'm going to be talking about, it's not ready for market. It doesn't make it less interesting, doesn't make it less valid. It just means the dynamic lighting shit you could see on like a BMW within the next couple of years. Just as an aside, did talk about current BMW design, did say to him, what about the buck teeth? He showed me a meme. I'll add the meme in here. It is quite amusing. He then showed me this Neue Klasse concept, and I'm going to put an image of, linked to that as well. I'll leave you to see what you think of it. I mean, I fundamentally agreed with the point that he'd made, that we develop some products for some markets and we deliver other products for other markets, and we believe that a product like the Neue Klasse might appeal to somebody like you, and yes, it did. So look, all of these YouTubers say without further ado, don't they? And look, there's been lots of ado. Without further ado, it's a filler phrase, isn't it? It's a filler phrase. But we like filler phrases. It's easier to understand the information if we use the filler phrases. You can hear me rustling my pages now, can't I? So after talking for 50 minutes, now I'm about to actually talk about what I witnessed at the conference. Monday, I missed the whole day. I was deciding what I was going to write. It was the school camping trip the day before. Like, it was, I went to campus, but I just worked with Barbara to confirm what we were going to do, and we understood how we were going to present. Tuesday morning, I missed 2. And Wednesday was the day that I was going to do the keynote in the morning. So I was definitely around, going to be around on the Wednesday. So on the Tuesday afternoon, I went to a panel on sustainability. There's actually a school of sustainability at Stanford. I wrote a session on a study on ecological driving advice and whether or not it works. How instructions influence the efficiency of eco-driving solutions. It was talk about, I put in quotes here, cognitive distractions. So they measured eye movements and basically how, if when you were like, turning off Enya and turning on Slayer, how at that moment you weren't focused on the car being like, I'm sorry, Dave, I need you to take second gear now. I'm sorry, Dave. I need you to take second gear now. So in other words, people pay attention to eco driving if they're not doing something else. This was a team of academics from Berkeley, which I just thought was somehow typical. It's like such it's just coming from such a place of not understanding motoring as it has been, and just it's not even car hating. I feel it's like it's like paving a parking lot over wildflowers and not even perceiving that you're killing all the wildflowers. That's how it made me feel about it. It really was pretty shocking. The conclusion of the research was that drivers need to be in what was called in the right status, i.e. concentrating, to be able to accept ecological driving advice. I wondered, I'm not sure what status I need to be in to accept ecological driving advice. Rarely have I just feel like this was like when you see an interesting car passing you on the freeway at a high rate of speed on the other side. It was there for a moment. It just passed. For a moment, we were communicating on the side, and now we've just passed. I really was not. There was another presentation in that sustainability session which I missed, which was about getting EV chargers installed in homes. And there was another one about incorporating shared autonomous cars and buses properly for taxi and delivery services. One of the questions was, what are you excited for in the future? The answers were the one individual, I can't remember her name, blonde French lady. She was talking about, and I can't remember which city it was she was talking about, but she was talking about a business model where the city was paying Uber to do the last mile of the bus route. In other words, people who live right out in the sticks, instead of them riding the bus, they call an Uber, and then the Uber is paid for by, the Uber fare is no more than the bus fare, because it's like part of public transport. And I just thought that was just one of those little wrinkles that you don't think about. And then when you see it, you're like, wow, there's the future efficiencies that we can accomplish are enormous. Effect, of course, is compounded by autonomy, and it's compounded by the fact that we can increasingly have, the DoorDasher can be the Uber as well, if that makes sense. It can be delivering people and goods when we can join the algorithms up properly. The Berkeley lady, when asked about the future, talked about 0 pedestrian fatalities. She talked about how pedestrian fatalities had gone up recently. And I guess I'm like, you're the one to blame for all of these stupid driving, impeding, more space for pedestrians, So in San Francisco, they put all these bollards up around curbs. So where people used to stand off the curb, and if you were using all the roads, you might hit them. Right now, instead of turfing people, instead of encouraging people to stand on the bloody pavement, no, now they've put these bollards round, so people are fine standing in the road, and now you have to square off the corner in the car, which if you're in a big vehicle is hard to do. It's literally, they've made it harder to drive so that even if you're drunk and fall off the pavement, you can't get run over. Just for me, I feel like it's a back to front way of thinking about it. Pedestrians have to be responsible for themselves. one of the others, a woman that lived in London, who was on the panel as well, her answer was that she was interested to see what she called friendly and easier to use interior design. And by friendly, she meant more intuitive UI. In other words, I don't know that's what she said. And she also said that nothing was more important than safety and security. I wrote that down. Nothing is more important than safety and security. What happened to the freedom of the open road? There's no freedom of the open road when nothing is more important than safety and security. I'm sorry, Dave. I can't let you do that. I'm sorry, Dave. I can't let you do that. The other thing that Miss Nothing is more important than safety and security said was that the driver is relieved from the heavy burden of being told about eco driving. So their research was that you didn't want to overburden the guy with too much information. You had to wait for the right time to tell him about eco driving. And I'm just I just wrote down, it's the opposite of the old Jack Brabham story, isn't it? They said to Jack Brabham once, Jack, how are you? How are you so fast? What advice do you have? And he said, well, lean close and let me tell you. More throttle, less brake. Well, this is the opposite, isn't it? Eco driving is simply less throttle and less brake, isn't it? It's the same thing. It's less throttle. With most EVs, with the regen braking, it's one pedal driving. So you just have to learn how to coast up to this. If you can't learn that, my God, how drunk are you? How uncoordinated are you if you can't do that? It is one pedal driving, yet the driver needs to be relieved from the heavy burden of being told how to drive ecologically. I mean, it's just so. Sustainability is more than EVs. It's changing city infrastructure too. It's comparatively obvious, isn't it? But when you say it in that way, but it makes you realise how infantile the approach of, replace everything with an EV and we'll be fine. It makes you realize how infantile that approach is. It makes you realize how urban personal mobility is as much about infrastructure, far more about infrastructure than it is about whether we ride in a bus or in an electric Volkswagen or in a, gas-powered Mercury. I think it was the French lady who said, instead of so many lanes, cities need to take lanes away from cars. And I was like, oh, yes, that's exactly what's been happening in San Francisco, that the city has taken the lane away from the car. So on the school run at the moment, it used to be this 2-lane sweeper where you could weave in and out of the slow people and usually get through the next green light. Whereas now they've done it where it's 1 lane for cars, 1 lane for the cyclists. And now you can't weave. So it means you always get caught at the light. So it means that even if I'm in a Zen mood and I'm I won't drive in the cycling lane today. Even if I'm in a Zen, because I've never driven in the cycling lane, even if you think I won't do that, by the time the light, you then get caught at the light and you sit at the traffic light waiting for the 2 or 3 people in front to, finish chewing at their 3rd Xanax of the day or something, or feeding their kid in the back seat or something like that. I mean, I don't know what people do at traffic lights not to go, because, in theory, it's possible for you to just drive around them every time because there's nobody in this. The light turns green and you can just drive all the way around them. It's like, it's like a Fernando Alonso start where you're on the third row, but you're third into the first corner because you've got driven through the middle. I feel like I do that. I feel like it would be possible, just in theory, to do that all the time. To be honest, right? I said this to the boy. It's like when they did the pedestrian when they turned the right hand lane of the M4 from Heathrow into London. When they turned that into a taxi only lane. At first, I was like, as I said in the pod the other day, like, what the fuck have they done to me pub? This was mine. I was used to it. It was familiar. If you don't get that reference, the Mac lads, I'll put the link in. It's not safe for work, highly offensive, but it reflects how people feel about change coming to the things that they love. And because I love motoring, when the change came to the outside lane of the M4, a section of road which I historically used to see a good deal of speed along, a piece of road that I loved because you came along, you got over Heathrow, and then you got onto the Westway. And I remember coming into London with my dad, in the 80s, and you used to be able to get onto the Westway at Autobahn speeds. I'm not saying that we necessarily ever did that, but you used to be able to do that, onto the Chiswick flyover there. But then, they turned the whole section from Heathrow to this 50-mile limit. Well, then I realised, right, I could ride it on my motorcycle. I was allowed. You were allowed in the taxi lane. Well, then it became like my own private overtaking lane. Well, in a sense, that's what's happened with these, So at the moment, in theory, one can just completely bend the rules and take advantage of it. I'm not saying I would ever dream of doing that, but, you can. So, but I mean, yeah, it's the roads are becoming, they are by design becoming less free, and it is driven by the theory of these academics. Instead of so many lanes, cities need to take away lanes from cars. The other thing that I've written down, and this was a guy from Toyota who stood up and said this, is that, we just need to walk more. We need to design communities that are set up around walking. And Stanford is an ideal illustration of a community which is set up around walking and cycling. And yes, it's weather-based, but with electric cycles, we can extend that range. We can all be a bit more like Amsterdam and a bit more like the London of the 1970s that I knew. So you can see I'm conflicted here, can't you? You can see I'm conflicted by the efficiency on the left hand, but I just, oh man, nothing is more important than safety and security. I mean, it's, it just makes me want to, I don't know, it just makes me come over all, get Enya off the stereo and wear the fucker Slayer. Like, the 8 videos. Let me talk about those next. The first one was from Robert Bosch, and it was looking at what it called chauffeur deceleration for autonomous cars. So really what it was saying was that, we looked at the way that chauffeurs slow down, and it showed a graph representation of that. And then we tried to replicate that with an autonomous cars. Current autonomous systems tend to just do one step, whereas the chauffeur tended to do a 2-step deceleration stage. It felt a little bit like boiling the ocean to me, but this is where we are with autonomous car research at the moment, that we're fixing these sort of edge cases. And I said to you, I mentioned earlier, one of the striking things about the Waymo was that it worked brilliantly. It drives like I might want to drive. At no point could I fault its driving the times that I've ridden in Waymos. I must have done 3 or 4 rides now around the city here. Nothing on the highway, nothing longer than about 20 minutes. So, I guess this is necessary, but it feels, it shows the incremental steps that we're taking this video. The next one was about resting better in EVs. Now, what I thought this might be about was I thought it might be about, basically turning your car, instead of like economy class plane seat, turning your car seat into something that was more like business class or maybe even Emirates first class, where you could actually sleep properly in the car. Because with autonomy coming, with people, with Uber drivers who come from, they drive from a poor part of the state into the city because they can earn more money over the weekend in the city, but then they won't go home. They'll just sleep in the car and work throughout the weekend. I thought it might be something around facilitating that, but it wasn't. It was some bollocks mode where if you did the school run every morning, the car knew that you were doing the school run, and it knew if you reclined the seat, you wanted to sleep. So it automatically, turned some soothing music on and, put the seat to your favorite, like, heater setting. It knows that you're about to get to school. So a minute before you arrive, it like shakes the seat to gently wake you up. I mean, I just had no idea what the rest mode added that reclining the seat and turning the heater on yourself couldn't do. Totally solving a problem that didn't bloody exist. Such a bollocks thing, I thought. The next one was Dorim. And I'll put a link into this because this is really bizarre. So this is electric minibus which travels around the community, which is glass-sided, so you can see people inside it, so it's easy for you to make friends with them. I know. It was South Korean, and I guess it's aimed at the fact that a lot of people have real social isolation in South Korea. So the example was like some old bloke who got out to play mahjong, or another example was an only child who had no friends and played the computer all the time. Now he could play the computer with people in the Dorim bus or something. It looked shiny. Who knows? I know nothing about the problem that it was purporting to solve. It seemed to be very regionally specific problem, and the solution seemed, the problem seems like a real problem. The bus with transparent sides, it seemed like, people are really lonely, so we made this great bacon. It seemed a bit like that to me. Now everyone's eating the bacon and they can make friends with each other because they're eating the bacon. It seemed like the bus, it could be, it could be anything. It could be eating bacon. It could be eating ice cream. It could be, rolling naked in the grass. It could have been anything. Dog's just chewing up my action plan. I guess it's better if it's chewed up, isn't it? Then I won't know what I meant to do and am failing to do by spending too long doing this. BMW dynamic light. That was the fourth video. I mean, I put here cheesy and pointless, but a really clear application, which is just making BMW seem even more futuristic and cool. I wrote down here, this is beautiful from the video. Imagine a light that is mindful. So that's right. When you get in the car, if it senses that you're in an aggro mood, it'll be all mellow. Or, if you're driving aggro, it'll be aggro, do red, lighting. Also, that thing I was talking about earlier where it can, shoot different light. It has it can shoot different light onto different surfaces inside the car. And that light can also be in the form of buttons. So this is getting away from the business of, you have to go into a menu and a drop down and all of that to change the heater or to put the window down. To get away from that, you can have, but to also get away from the business of, being able to design a clean interior that doesn't look like the flight deck of Concorde in terms of the number of switches and dials and all of that. So you don't need to do that. The idea is that this dynamic lighting can so you can do, you can have the lighting for the heater buttons, say, on the dashboard there, so and the passenger can hit the button and adjust it, or you could, what my student was telling me is that yes, you can have it on the back of your hand because that's what the video was showing, but you need to do like a haptic movement to tell it to do that. So I'm going to find out more about this BMW dynamic lighting, but this was a really, really weird, really cool, really like futuristic-y kind of a thing. So video number 5, I'll just read what I wrote down. Human takeover of autonomous cars important. Hard for deaf mofos. And I guess it would be, right, because in that moment that I was talking about earlier, that 3 to 5 seconds where the car's alerting you to the need that it can't drive anymore, it's got some issue, it needs you to drive. A lot of those warning methods are going to be some kind of the ubiquitous beep, aren't they? And obviously that's not going to work for people who don't hear properly. So look, right, this was another one that was sort of about lights, and how you can use different lights to, basically communicate to people, they need to do something or go in a certain direction or something like that. Number 6 was the one that I voted for. I felt like this was the best solution, although I felt like the BMW one was clearly the most baked and the most ready for market. I felt like the BMW one was kind of, it's like a cool thing, but it was a trinket. It wasn't, doing anything really meaningful. This number 6 one I felt was really kind of a meaning, was more meaningful. It was communicating what the autonomous vehicle is doing to people who are inside it. And you're like, what? But really, it's that moment where you get in the Waymo and you say, take me downtown, and suddenly it starts driving not in the direction that you normally go. Now, in that moment, you don't know that there's been an accident and this is why it's driving a different way. If it communicates that to you, you're like, oh, great. You're relieved. The car's doing a great job. If it doesn't communicate that to you, you're like, what are you doing, you crazy computer? Stop. Like, no, go the other. You know what I mean? And many of us have had that situation. It's, we're all familiar with computers that are spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning. And you wish they just say to you, look, I'm broken. I can't do this. This won't work, but they don't do that, do they? They spin endlessly. And what we're saying is that this was some research that was thinking about how to communicate to people in a way that they trust the car. And the net of the research was that for normal things, you don't need very much information. In other words, when my wife calls the Waymo, it comes, she gets in the, she tells it, take me downtown to my office. This where she goes every day. When she gets in the car, and it sets off, it's not going to make a big song and dance over the fact that the time that it's going to get there is normal. And the route that it's going to take is normal. However, if there's been an accident and it's going to take a different route, then it needs to communicate a lot more information to tell her that that's what the situation is. So, again, I feel a little bit like the research that revealed that if you listen to Motorhead, you tended to drive faster. It's kind of obvious, right? If you're listening to Motorhead, you're probably either in the mood for driving fast or somebody who drives fast anyway. Definitely listening to fast music is going to make you drive faster, right? Didn't really need a research paper to prove that. But you do, right? Because until somebody does the research, it's just opinion, conjecture. Something I pulled out of my arse, and that won't do. So I like this because this was some research around something that I think's really, really important. The other environment is, the illustration I just gave was my wife in a Waymo. The use cases that a lot of these researchers see. And a lot of the researchers, they're based in Asia, they're based in Germany, a lot of them were based in Utrecht. These tend to be communities where people are riding the bus more. And they tend to be communities that might be really well served by small buses. And I know, I prattled endlessly about my class, didn't I, at the beginning of this pod. One of very early on in the class, when we were talking about urban mobility solutions, the idea of the small bus really crops up again and again. It really works well in certain communities. There was a small bus that got round the medieval Borgo bit of Rome. I remember the medieval Borgo bit of Rome. I remember when I lived there before I was rudely interrupted by the corgi. Arthur, knock it off! It's just the postman, dude. So number 7 was about infotainment complexity and how that affects driving concentration. I wrote that it seems obvious that a complicated stereo equals distracted driving. They concluded that more research was needed. So that seemed, The next one was I wrote a talking AV butler, or autonomous vehicle butler. I then wrote fucking annoying. I then wrote video with silly, squeaky AI voice. So, yeah, I think people like that one. I'm now hesitating, aren't I? Because I don't want to offend the researcher who did that work. And really, I might find it fucking annoying, but really, it might be a useful thing for a lot of people. When I'm struck by the fact that I'm now moving into old age, the reality is that these students that I teach, they're like half my age, and they might never have need to drive as far as I have over the years. That for many people, driving is an in the city experience. You never would drive a long way, an hour and a half up the freeway to Napa. That's it. And interestingly, of course, that's the kind of thing that the autonomous car can do really well. The freeway stuff, it finds easy. The bits of driving that are really good fun, it finds AVs, of course, find easy. And these edge cases that the AV developers are wrestling with, they tend to lie in an urban environment because there's just so many more variables and so much, unpredictability. And I think another thing that I'll touch on here, and it's just a ridiculous irony of the space. You may have listened to the pod that I did a couple of months ago about LIDAR developments in LIDAR. And you might remember that in it, I was amused that the LIDAR developers are basically all partnered with German car makers, and the German car makers each have their own, clearly technical partners in developing autonomy. And clearly that's because they want to make sure that their kind of autonomy is somehow superior or differentiated from those that their competitors are going to come to market with. Yeah, so there was another one about lane keep assist and lane center assist and, adaptive cruise for cyclists. I mean, the results of the experiment were spoiled by the fact that many participants, and you saw these poor schmucks riding on a bike wearing a VR headset. Because of the VR thing, people were sick. So, which reminded me of one of the students, of one of my former students who was in the class the very first time that I did it. He's a professor now at a university on the East Coast. Bravo, Dave. I did a thing where he had a lab that it overlooked the main quad at Stanford. It was an impressive room, and I guess Infinity, I remember, had paid for him to have this. Him and other researchers, of course, have this. Like, basically, it was like half of an M35 that was in the room. So where you actually like sat in a real car, and then it was a driving simulator. Well, you sat in a real M35, but it didn't move like that, and that really gave me, especially on deceleration, the worst motion sickness. And I sort of battled through it because I thought it might get better, and I wanted to do Dave's experiment, but I lay on the grass. If you look at pictures of Stanford, the oval there, like with the palm trees there, I lay there on the grass for 2 hours before I felt well enough to walk back to the car. So what this reveals to me is that, the experiments that they're doing are, in that case, almost many of the participants delivered flawed results due to the sort of motion sickness. So I don't know. I mean, do you need help riding in the middle of the road? I mean, maybe you do, but I don't think you need a technical solution. I just think you need to ride the bike better. It's a little bit like the eco driving, and you can only tell people the eco message when they're not adjusting the stereo. Like, no, it's no more complicated than press the throttle more gently, coast more, less throttle, less brake. Literally, less throttle, less brake. It's really like, for me, like, I don't need the machine to wet nurse me like that. I just don't. And it's offensive to me that these technologies I feel like are being forced upon me. And I feel like that is, if that sounds Trumpy, it shouldn't do, right? It's not unnatural to feel uncomfortable at a pace of rapid progress. And it's not uncomfortable. There's nothing wrong about questioning whether or not the progress really is progress, because I think when you're de-inventing driving or de-inventing cycling, instead of the freedom of cycling, now it's all going to be controlled by the computer. How is that remotely a step forward? Like, how? Who was really thinking clearly when they thought that might be? Again, I don't want to. I probably have offended people, haven't I? But thereby, if anybody, any poor blighter who did that research has the misfortune to be listening to this. Anyway, the next one was enhancing pro-social behavior in micro-mobility. So basically, it was people fucking hate scooters, those twist and goes. What can we do to fix that? And if you think of it, right, actually, it's a super valid thing to be working on, because scooters are an excellent transportation solution, but because of the way they were introduced in cities, people hate them. If people had thought about how they should be introduced, if, for example, instead of being able to just park willy-nilly, they'd been corralled in a particular area, like close to bus stops or something like that. If something like that had happened, then at that point, people might have, if there'd have been proper rules and training applied, so people weren't feeling like they were, going to be run over whilst they were walking their dog on the sidewalk by some speeding youth on a scooter. You just needed to. There were a couple of very easily foreseeable issues the companies made no effort to head off. That means that scooters got a bad rap and got banned in lots of cities, I think, in a completely unnecessary way. I think there's absolutely fully scooters, twist and go, stand up electric guys. Some of these things can do 50 miles an hour and actually ride the bumps. I'm not suggesting necessarily there's a place for that, but what I'm saying is in cities like London and Paris and New York, where you might pop out of the tube and have, a 20-minute walk at the end of the tube, being able to turn that into a 5-minute ride on the scooter, that seems like a really meaningful way of taking foot traffic off the sidewalk and, riding an Uber or riding a Waymo or riding the bus or something like that. That just seemed sensible for me. And then apart from anything else, crudely, scooters appeal to me because it's two wheels and it's independent. And that's really what I'm getting at, is I want to feel independent. I'm interested in maintaining the freedom of the open road, not in restricting the freedom of the open road. That's really my agenda in this. I don't want to be some Trumpy Luddite. I just want to maintain the freedom of the open road. Look, so there's a lack of regulation and lack of trust of scooter users. Looking at how to change that. Can't read my own writing. Oh, pro-social driving is driving which is safe and considerate of others. Pro-social driving has been about pedestrians up to now, but we thought about scooters in our research here. If you tell people what they do wrong, they can improve and be more pro-social. So in other words, a lot of scooter riders, when they cut people off, they didn't actually realize that they were upsetting people. Seems a bit hard for me to believe, but there you go. They measured space sharing conflict. And I guess a lot of the presentations, I'm not sure if this one did, but a lot of the presentations use this Unity platform, which is an AI way of doing the research. So in other words, they didn't do the research themselves. They didn't actually have real people on scooters. I don't know about this particular one because Barbara only told me what Unity was afterwards, that it's like AI experimentation. So if you think of it, you can prototype experiments really fast, but at the same time, these experiments didn't take place in the real world. They all took place in the brain of a computer. So now this experiment, which took place in the brain of a computer, is now going to somehow enhance the way that we behave riding scooters on the sidewalk. It's just, who knows? It might do, but I'm just telling you, I'm just trying to just illustrate just how eye-poppingly deep this rabbit hole goes. So being pro-social in the case of these scooters was basically yielding to other sidewalk users rather than, zooming too close to them or, cutting them off or potentially even running them down. Although that was not a scenario that looked at. So when you gave people the feedback, that meant that they increased the passing gaps. If you were like, look, you really cut that dude up, don't do that in future. People were like, oh, all right, And it also increased their willingness to yield. They were more ready to stop at things if you shamed them a bit. Who knew, right? Because I'm sure there's some riders who just be like, you know what, fuck you. But I guess in the case of the experiment they did, it made a difference. It's just partly paid for by Honda R&D. I guess Honda R&D have got a lot of money that they don't need. So one thing that came up in the questions was perhaps you have something similar to these dongles that insurance companies have you put in the OBD2 slot that monitors how you drive. So you can supposedly get a better rate or, more likely so they can ding people who are bad. But you could maybe do something like like that if you were a shitty rider, you could just, they'd bill you or ban you accordingly. I guess the other things that cropped up was in the discussion afterwards. We talked a bit more generally about scooters, and then one guy pointed out that a pothole can kill a scooter user, and of course it can, right? The big ones that they have in San Francisco. So this whole business of them not being allowed to be on the sidewalks, that forces them into the road with other traffic that's moving faster. It forces them to the edge of the road. It often, it can literally force them into potholes. So the thought was that it's that infrastructure point again, but it's also the sort of other point that was made was that scooters represent a limited solution, because in order to use them, you have to rethink your lifestyle. So there's always that thing about, you have to be like, if you're not a young, energetic person, generally speaking, you're going to find it quite hard to use a scooter. And, one person used, I thought, a slightly fatuous example to talk about, how do you do the Costco run? It's a little bit like, the reason why Americans need a Suburban or Fiesta. But notwithstanding that, the fact is that scooters do require a significant rethink of city infrastructure and users. It requires a significant rethink of driving lifestyle, and not for nothing. I looked at the Lime scooters here, which is the only scooter ride sharing thing that survived here. I used to do Revel mopeds, and only Lime are left. But to be honest, it's so bloody expensive. It's easier to Uber. If you're on the thing for an hour, it costs you like $20. Well, that's crazy, isn't it? I mean, that means you ride the thing for 10 hours, you could fucking well buy one from Amazon. What would it's exactly, Arthur, exactly. There's no point in doing it at all. So moving to day 3 of the conference, really interesting concept, which was my first note of the day, which was the notion of a taxonomy, a glossary of terms, if you will, of the communication methods which pedestrians and car users use with each other. So it's honking, it's headlight flashing, it's gestures, all of those methods of communication in order to basically teach those things to autonomous vehicles so that they can, pick up on them. It is funny because, of course, when they were talking about how these things are in some ways nationally and regionally specific. And I immediately thought of that thing that people always do in France and they never used to do in England, which is if you're on an N road, or this used to be true, I don't know if it's true anymore, that if you were on an N road and people come towards you were flashing their headlights, you knew there was a speed trap up the road. They used to flash their headlights to warn you that there was a speed trap up the road. The talk was the as I said, that these are nationally and regionally specific, and a comment was made that these studies are being done in countries like Germany and Holland, where people tend to really follow the rules, and therefore all the research is done in an environment it's done in quite a controlled, sterile, although it's the real world, it's a far more controlled and sterile version of the real world than Calcutta, Mombasa, Nairobi, or even for that matter, Minneapolis, St. Paul. The next one was entitled Steering Towards Safety, an Embodied Driver Guide. So this was like having a friend in the car directing you. It was the way that they'd set it up was it was a bit like, well, it was one of those like mannequin kind of wooden figures, but like a hologram of it, basically on the dashboard where the CD player used to be, or the cup holder is, high up on the dashboard there, in the middle. But yeah, the notion was that the best way to have directions is have a friend like in the car directing you. They sort of lost me at that because, it's the surefire way for Dana and I to have a fight if she tries to do any kind of directions for me. I do much better in the car on my own. I mean, I do all right if one of my friends is directing me. I feel like if people drive like a long distance, they know how to direct people, and I feel like people who don't drive long distances, don't think ahead sufficiently to, anyway, I don't want to slate my wife's driving skills. I just did, didn't I? Totally. Sorry, Dana. I mean, to slate your driving skills is probably just our total, you say tomato, I say tomato. Anyway, they listed 21 types of gesture. I wrote here, it was a safety AI, safety AV version of rally pace notes. So, for turn left, it's easy to find a gesture, but there's a storm coming, you need to be aware you might not want to do this long journey because the weather's really bad on this long journey. It's hard to find a gesture for that. I wondered, I actually asked a question at the microphone there. I wondered if you could use rally driver pace notes. I feel like they would have developed the, sharp right, gentle right, go straight, all of that stuff. They would have developed quite well. I wondered if that could be applied. And the researcher was actually a Finn. So I thought that might work quite well. The next one was how do autonomous cars elicit uncivil behavior? So as the woman from the Swedish transportation ministry said to me, she'd seen people abusing and yelling at a Waymo. Why do people hate the autonomous cars? Because, her own community experiment with autonomous cars, people have felt very positively about the way the autonomous car had moved with society. I encountered this term, the griefing of AVs. So that is, it's obviously a British researcher that's named that, isn't it? Which is deliberately fucking with the AV. It's deliberately like causing a situation, where the AV can't go forward and can't go back or something like that. So it wasn't actually. So it was measuring the ways in which people grief AVs, and the specific example it had was an example of a delivery robot that a cyclist was riding around and around and around, and in so doing was stopping it from moving forward, and was doing that quite consciously. They rode away, it started moving again, they rode back, they did the thing again. So this was the example. It wasn't quite the example of the person burning the Waymo in Chinatown a couple of months ago, but it's poking around that idea, right? It's poking around the idea that because of the way the AV that was used in Sweden had been used, it was used close to home for people with Alzheimer's. So it gave these people mobility, and it took them to and buy ice cream, and it did it sort of on a walkway, and it went at 9 kilometers an hour. So it went very slowly. This was why people had a different reaction to it from, the way that, somebody who's presumably had a pretty shitty shrift of life in living in the streets in San Francisco, and they see this Jaguar with nobody even in it driving itself. It's not, I find it understandable that as the face of modernity and technology and everything that they hate, I understand why they might want to take out their rage on the better they take out their rage on the Jaguar than on Waymo employees, right? Much better they take their rage out on the car than on that. So we were poking around why, some people want to take selfies with the Waymo, other people want to attack it. We're poking around that because we now have this term griefing, which even describes the way that some people react to autonomous vehicles in their community. So I think it's interesting that we're measuring these kind of things. The next thing, really interesting piece of research. And I think the most interesting thing for me about it was the fact that it incorporated a piece of established research, which is called the bystander effect. And it's quite simple, that if there's other people there, you're less likely to do something about something that's happened. So the particular example was you're riding on an autonomous bus, and all of a sudden a drunk person gets on and starts acting the goat. If only you were there, you're more likely to do something, get off the bus, confront them, You're more likely to do something than if there's a group of people there. If there's a group of people there, you tend to wait and see what they do. And this is a proven piece of research. So it was quoted from the 1970s. The quote was almost as old as I was, which was interesting because none of the other academic research that was cited was earlier than the turn of the century, which, again, yet another occasion where and another moment where I felt a little old. So shuttle buses, AV shuttle buses, and looking at the ways in which people respond to there being no staff on the bus, because when there's a bus driver there, you feel more secure. When there's a bus driver there, if the traffic's not going anywhere, you can say, oh, is there an accident up here? And the bus driver will be like, maybe, although I think there were roadworks earlier in the day. You can't have that kind of interaction if the bus is just there on its own. So what it did quite interestingly was it broke, I think it broke the process down into awareness, recognition, responsibility, options for action, and then a decision to act. And the bystander effect makes you less likely to move to stage 3, the responsibility stage. So in other words, if the autonomous bus has a flat tire, but is still trying to drive on the flat tire, if there's a group of people there, you're more likely just to sit there, do nothing. Whereas if you're on your own, you're more likely to step up to the microphone and be like, hey, the bus is driving on a flat tire. Like, what? Tell it to stop. That it's more likely you're more likely to do that. So I guess really what it said was it applied the bystander effect research specifically to a very real world situation in AV buses, and had noted that in a situation where the more people there are on the bus, the less likely people are to do anything about it. So you need to put in place something in order to overcome that bystander effect. That was the gist of it. And that's it. All right, so to wrap this up, this is a really exciting community to be a part of. Really interesting research. Some of it, as I say, a bit half-baked, but this is inevitable in this kind of space. If you're pushing the edges of thought in any space, some of the experiments are going to seem half-baked. Some of the ideas are going to seem half-baked. The important thing is, like when you go to a modern art gallery or something like that, you take away what you can from it. And I found it really interesting because I feel like just the very fact that everything that we talked about was about communication with AVs. There was nothing to do with the steering wheel or the seats or, whether you should use a knob or a dial to turn the heating up. There was nothing about that. It was all about thinking deeply about how we're going to communicate with the mobility solutions, with autonomous mobility solutions. And that is just an exciting field to be a part of. I hope I've communicated some of those ideas properly. I appreciate you listening all the way through. Thank you, Drive Through.
This episode has been brought to you by Grand Touring Motorsports as part of our Motoring Podcast Network. For more episodes like this, tune in each week for more exciting and educational content from organizations like the Exotic Car Marketplace, the Motoring Historian, Break Fix, and many others. If you'd like to support Grand Touring Motorsports and the Motoring Podcast Network, sign up for one of our many sponsorship tiers at www.patreon.com/GT Motorsports. Please note that the content, opinions, and materials presented and expressed in this episode are those of its creator, and this episode has been published with their consent. If you have any inquiries about this program, please contact the creators of this episode via email or social media as mentioned in the episode.